She's a waitress. Not a translator. I'll bet 300 chaos she doesn't even know what language this contract's in. The words sliced through the Grand Monarch Hotel's chandelier-lit ballroom like shattered glass. 100 forks paused midair. Conversation stopped. All eyes turned to the man making the wager. Marcus Bennett, silver-haired, sharp-suited, and sharper-tongued, leaned back in his leather chair, grinning like he was hosting a game show. Between sips of Bordeaux and smug glances, he pointed across the table. At her, Aaliyah Carter, 24, stood poised in a crisp apron, balancing a tray of champagne and composure. She had just finished refilling Mr. Zhao's glass when the words hit. Now, she was the center of attention, not because of who she was, but because of who they assumed she wasn't. "She's been listening all night," Marcus said, waving a thick contract in Mandarin. "Maybe she picked up a word or two while serving dumplings." The crowd chuckled uncomfortably. Mr. Zhao's face stiffened. Other Chinese investors shifted in their seats, their expressions caught between offense and disbelief. Aaliyah blinked once. Then she calmly set her tray down. "May I see the contract?" she asked softly. The question was not defiant, just measured, quiet. It was the kind of calm that unnerves the loud. Marcus smirked, rising halfway to hand her the pages, like he was passing a prop to an actor. Everyone expected a performance. No one expected what came next. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that the young woman they'd just made the punchline of their $300,000 joke had been decoding contracts. Like this since high school. By day, she served cocktails under chandeliers. By night, she translated 6 languages on a second-hand laptop. Before this night was over, she wouldn't just read the contract. She would expose the fraud it tried to hide and rewrite the power in the room, line by line. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the grin still on his face as he handed over the thick sheaf of documents. His fingers brushed Aaliyah's deliberately, just long enough to communicate who he thought was in control. Around the table, the laughter had thinned but not vanished. Polite smirks, hushed amusement, that peculiar tension people mistake for entertainment when they're watching someone about to be humiliated. Aaliyah didn't flinch. She accepted the papers with both hands, nodding slightly to Mr. Zhao. Her posture remained measured, composed, the way she'd trained herself to move when all eyes were watching, but none were seeing. She flipped the first page, then came the pause. A few awkward beats of silence hung in the air, the kind of silence that grows heavy when it overstays its welcome. Marcus exhaled through his nose, chuckling. "Need a second to Google it?" Aaliyah didn't respond. Her eyes moved steadily across the page, lips parting just slightly, and then she spoke. The first sentence came slowly, each word shaped with careful precision. Her accent was soft, controlled, Mandarin with a slight Beijing inflection. 该协议是对各方权益和义务的确认. The silence turned absolute. She kept reading, line by line, clause by clause, and with each breath, her pace quickened, her confidence revealed itself. What began as a quiet act of defiance evolved into something undeniable. Her voice was calm but unshakable. Every tone mark landed with exacting precision. She wasn't just fluent. She belonged to the language. The air in the ballroom shifted. Mr. Zhao leaned forward, brows knitting, eyes narrowing not in confusion, but interest. The other Chinese investors exchanged glances, then turned back to Aaliyah like students trying to keep up with a lecture. By the time she reached the second page, Marcus had stopped smiling. The final stroke came midway down the 4th sheet. Aaliyah's finger hovered over a paragraph buried in dense legalese. "This clause," she said, now in English, her voice unwavering, "alters the equity structure of the agreement post-signature. Specifically, it reroutes a percentage of profits through a holding company listed under a different name, a shell corporation." She looked up. Her eyes locked with Marcus's, hidden in the footnotes. Not illegal, but deeply misleading. Mr. Zhao's face hardened. One of his associates stood abruptly and leaned over Aaliyah's shoulder, reading the section she indicated. His mouth twitched. "他说的没错," he muttered. "She's not wrong." Marcus's throat worked as he tried to swallow. He opened his mouth, then closed it. A beat passed. Then another. Phones came out, not in a flash, not in some viral frenzy, but in slow, deliberate motion. Quiet hands setting cameras to record. Dinner guests turned their chairs slightly, pretending to be casual. A hush fell, punctuated only by the soft click of lenses and the occasional clink of untouched silverware, and still Aaliyah read. She finished the last page with clinical poise, flipped it over and set the document down as if she'd just finished reciting a menu. Then she bowed slightly toward Mr. Zhao and said in Mandarin, 如果您需要，我可以逐条解释. If you'd like, I can break down each clause for clarity. It wasn't just the language. It was the tone. She wasn't performing. She was offering professional courtesy. Marcus looked around, suddenly unsure if he was still the host of the moment or its casualty. Mr. Zhao turned toward him slowly. His expression was unreadable, but his silence was not. Nor was the quiet glare of the other executives who had just discovered they were nearly conned, and who had been saved not by their multi-million-dollar legal team, but by a waitress they hadn't bothered to notice until now. The back of Marcus's neck flushed crimson. Aaliyah gently closed the contract and stepped back, folding her hands in front of her apron. Her shoulders remained level. Her eyes are steady. She gave no hint of pride, no triumph, only the quiet professionalism of someone who knew what she was doing and had done it before. One woman in a red dress at a nearby table whispered, "Holy hell." Another guest murmured, "Who is she?" Marcus heard every word, and for the first time in years, he had no comeback. What had begun as a spectacle designed to amuse the powerful had become something else entirely, a reckoning. And the woman he'd mocked? She hadn't just exposed a fraud buried in the fine print. She had dismantled his control, clause by clause, word by word, in a language he didn't even understand. Her words didn't just translate language, they rewrote power. The silence didn't end right away. It lingered, thick and taut, like the moment after a glass shatters but before anyone moves to sweep it up. Marcus sat frozen, the weight of what had just happened sinking in by degrees. Around him, the glittering room full of elites began to stir, slowly at first. A whisper here, a chuckle there. Someone at the far table tried to hide their laughter behind a linen napkin, and still Aaliyah stood where she was, hands clasped neatly in front of her, as if she hadn't just unraveled a multi-million-dollar con in front of San Francisco's most powerful investors. Her expression didn't change. No smirk, no gloating. Just composure. Control. Mr. Zhao stood and walked over to her, extending both hands in gratitude. "Thank you," he said, switching to Mandarin. "That was remarkable." She responded in kind, offering a quiet, humble reply. The other Chinese partners followed suit. Nods, soft words, glances that now held respect instead of dismissal. At Marcus's table, no one looked at him. He could feel the heat rising up his neck, pooling behind his ears. His grin was gone, replaced by something sour and unfamiliar, something dangerously close to shame. Aaliyah gave a small bow to Mr. Zhao, then turned without fanfare. She picked up her tray from the side table and walked calmly toward the service entrance, heels clicking softly across the marble floor, as if none of this had happened, as if she hadn't just dismantled his ego in a language he couldn't speak. Marcus stood abruptly, ignoring the questioning looks from his guests, and followed her. She was already halfway down the service corridor, untying her apron as she walked when he called out, "Wait!" She stopped but didn't turn around. He hesitated. The hallway smelled like citrus cleaner and stainless steel, a stark contrast from the floral perfume of the ballroom. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she slowly turned to face him. Up close, she looked younger. Not timid, just tired. Her eyes, still sharp with clarity, met his with an unreadable expression. Marcus swallowed. How did you learn that?" His voice sounded strange to his own ears. Not accusing, not mocking, just unsteady. She blinked once, then glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to see if someone was watching. No one was. The clink of silverware and the murmurs of conversation echoed faintly from the ballroom. She shifted her weight and finally spoke. "My mom used to work double shifts too," she said quietly, "cleaning offices in downtown Oakland. I stayed at the library after school because it was safer than going home." She leaned against the wall, still holding the folded apron in her hands like a shield. "There was this librarian who used to leave books for me. Languages, mostly. Mandarin, Korean, Russian. At first, I just liked the characters. Then I started trying to sound them out. I'd copy the sounds by listening to YouTube videos after my shifts. Practiced accents by reading to myself in the walk-in freezer. She smiled faintly at that, the first crack in her armor. The acoustics are better in there than you'd think. Marcus stared at her, unsure what to say. I volunteer on weekends in Chinatown, she continued. Help kids with translation. Immigration stuff, school forms, whatever their parents can't read. I figured, if I can help someone understand the system, that's worth something. She looked up at him again. I'm studying linguistics at City College, nights and weekends. I want to work for the UN someday. Language accessibility. That's the goal. It wasn't pride in her voice. It wasn't even defiance. It was just truth. Simple, practiced truth she had told herself enough times to make it real. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. He had nothing. What could he possibly say to this woman, the one he had publicly mocked, wagered against, reduced to a prop for his amusement, who had just turned his entire evening into a footnote? He cleared his throat. I didn't mean... She raised an eyebrow. Didn't mean what? The silence stretched between them again. He looked away first. I should get back, she said finally, stepping past him. He didn't stop her. He didn't know how. From the edge of the hallway, he watched her push through the swinging door and step back into the ballroom. The hum of admiration met her instantly. Guests nodded. Some clapped. Mr. Zhao gestured to an empty seat beside him as if she belonged there. Marcus stayed where he was. The same woman he had mocked 30 minutes ago had saved his business partners, his reputation, maybe even his career. And now she was walking through a room full of people who had watched her become unforgettable. He stood in the shadows and watched her disappear into the glow, and for the first time in a long, long time, Marcus Bennett had nothing to say. It started with a single clip, an iPhone video, a little grainy, framed from a side angle. The kind of footage that usually captures celebrity sightings or drunken toasts. But this wasn't a toast. It was a takedown. The title read, Waitress, outsmarts Millionaire in perfect Chinese, and within hours it had spread like wildfire. By 8:03 a.m., it was on Twitter's trending list. By 9:12, Reddit had pinned it to the front page under R, Public Freakout. By noon, it had crossed oceans. The internet didn't just watch. It devoured it. The video opened with Marcus Bennett, laughing, smug, holding up the contract like a party trick. His voice cut through the chatter. 300 grand says she can't read a single line. Then came Alia's calm voice. The Mandarin. The silence that followed. Then the twist. Her finger pointing to the buried clause. The Chinese executive's shocked expressions. And the look on Marcus's face, caught in perfect resolution. The moment ego shattered into disbelief. Comment sections exploded. She's a legend. This is the most satisfying thing I've seen all year. Bro bet 300K and lost to a linguistic goddess. Memes followed. Someone photoshopped Marcus's stunned face onto a poker player folding a losing hand. Another pasted Aaliyah into the Matrix, lines of Chinese script cascading behind her. But it wasn't all applause. On Facebook and Instagram, the narrative twisted. A subset of voices accused Aaliyah of grandstanding, of setting him up, even of humiliating a paying client. She should have just walked away. Classier that way. Was she even allowed to speak like that during work? This generation loves attention. Congrats, you're famous for embarrassing someone. Aaliyah didn't respond. She was still working a double shift when her phone finally buzzed off the counter. 12 missed calls, dozens of texts, and an email from a morning show producer offering her a guest spot. That night, a camera crew showed up outside the Grand Monarch Hotel. By morning, there were reporters waiting outside her apartment complex. She declined all interviews. At least at first. The attention came too fast, too loud. She had spent her life learning to blend into the background, and now the world wouldn't stop staring. But not everyone wanted a soundbite. 3 days after the clip hit 1 million views, Aaliyah got a handwritten letter in her mailbox. No logo, no press pass, just a folded piece of stationery and a name, Clara Jennings. Investigative features, The Atlantic. Inside it read, I'd like to hear the story behind the silence, not the views, just the truth. When you're ready. Aaliyah kept that letter in her coat pocket. Elsewhere, Marcus Bennett was watching the same video. Again. His face stared back at him, paused mid-expression. The still frame had gone viral. The caption read, "When your net worth can't buy you a brain." He shut the laptop, then reopened it. This had been going on for days. His name trailed viral humiliation like a shadow. Articles with headlines, like "The man who bet against brilliance and tech titan toppled by a waitress," littered his search results. One of his board members called to say investors were concerned. His PR team wanted a statement. Apologize, reposition, reframe. The usual crisis script. But Marcus didn't answer. He just sat there in his high-rise office, watching the window instead of the screen, watching the light shift over the bay. The view that usually reminded him he had everything now felt like a wall of glass between him and something he couldn't define. He'd humiliated someone, that much was clear, but what unsettled him wasn't the backlash. It was her, Aaliyah Carter. Not just her fluency, not just the effortless way she'd dismantled a contract meant to fool billionaires, but the fact that she had done it without flinching, without needing applause, without even raising her voice. He'd seen genius before, hired it, fired it, funded it, but he had never misjudged it like that. He remembered the way she'd spoken to him in the corridor, calm, clear, unbothered by his title, his status, his shame. She hadn't asked for a favor. She hadn't tried to cash in. She just went back to work. He thought about the contract, the buried clause she'd exposed. If she hadn't caught it, his Chinese partners would have walked, or worse, gone public. That little trap would have detonated his next round of funding. She'd saved him, and he had tried to turn her into a joke. Marcus stood restless, pacing the length of the office. The marble floor beneath his feet felt colder than usual. The clip was still playing on mute, looping silently in the background. Her voice, when it came through the speakers, was measured even. Not the voice of someone seeking revenge, just the truth. That's what shook him the most. For the first time, Marcus Bennett saw brilliance without privilege, and it terrified him. The fluorescent lights in the university language lab buzzed quietly overhead. It was mid-evening, just late enough that most students had cleared out, leaving only the echo of keystrokes and the low hum of white noise machines meant to simulate conversation for speech analysis. Aaliyah sat near the back, earbuds in, switching between phonetic symbols on her screen and handwritten notes on dialect migration. She looked tired, the kind of tired that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from the weight of too much happening too fast. So when the glass door clicked open and Marcus Bennett stepped inside, she didn't hear it. He stood there for a moment, holding the doorknob like it might throw him out. He was in a tailored coat that didn't quite disguise how out of place he looked. Like a Wall Street transplant in a public library. Aaliyah finally noticed him when she reached for her charger and caught his reflection in the darkened window. She pulled one earbud out. Seriously? He took that as permission and walked forward slowly, hands in his pockets. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here." She leaned back, arms crossed. "This is a university. I'm not exactly hiding." "I know," he said a little too quickly. I've been trying to figure out how to approach this." "You? Well, showing up in a language lab unannounced is certainly a choice." He gave a tight, self-deprecating smile. "You're right. This is probably strange. I owe you something." She raised an eyebrow. "You mean besides an apology?" He winced. "That too." He pulled a folded check from his coat pocket and held it out like it might sting him. "The $300,000 from the bet." Aaliyah stared at it, didn't reach for it, just let it hover in the air between them like a question. "You don't owe me money," she said finally. "It was your moment. You earned it." She shook her head. "No, you turned it into a moment. I was just doing what I always do." Marcus lowered the check. "I don't need your money," she added, more gently now. "But I have an idea for something better." He blinked. "I'm listening." She stood and walked to the whiteboard behind her, where someone had half-erased a list of syntax rules. She picked up a marker and wrote a single word: access. "There are kids who could do what I did, or better, if they had the chance," she said. "But they don't, because language programs are underfunded, because schools in places like Oakland can barely afford textbooks, let alone tutors for non-native speakers, because nobody expects brilliance from the service industry, or from people who look like me." She capped the marker, So here's my pitch, she said. Take that money, and more, and invest it in a scholarship fund. Not just for college, but for early access. Language immersion, cultural mentorship, translation labs. Make it a bridge, not a ladder. Marcus looked at the board, then at her. And you'd run it? He asked. She nodded. I already have a name, the Carter Bennett Initiative. He gave a quiet chuckle. You're putting my name on it? Well, she smirked. You were part of the origin story. They stood in silence for a beat. Something had shifted. Not quite friendship, not yet, but something adjacent, a recognition. Marcus nodded slowly. I'll fund it. Aaliyah tilted her head. Just like that? I bet 300 grand that you couldn't read a contract, he said. I lost that bet spectacularly. This is the first thing I've been sure of in a while. She studied him. You bet against me once, Marcus, she said softly. Now let's see if you can bet on me. He smiled. The first one she'd seen from him that didn't feel performative. Deal. Over the weeks that followed, they worked together. Two people who couldn't have been more different, now tied to the same mission. Marcus, the polished investor with access to funding and networks. Aaliyah, the translator with the vision and the scars to match it. He brought strategy. She brought empathy. He showed her how to scale, to build infrastructure, to navigate bureaucracy. She showed him how language wasn't just a skill. It was identity, connection, survival. Sometimes, they argued, he pushed for efficiency. She fought for nuance. But the friction sharpened the project, made it real. They met in cafes, classrooms, and boardrooms. And slowly, something resembling mutual respect took root. Aaliyah never once asked for credit, but Marcus insisted on it. At the first press release, when the Carter Bennett Initiative was announced, he stood off to the side, letting her take the mic. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. She answered everyone with the same calm clarity that had stunned a ballroom full of billionaires. When someone asked what made her believe this project could change lives, she simply said, because I've lived on both sides of silence, and I know what language can do when someone finally hears you. Marcus watched from the wings. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the headline, and he was okay with that. The camera light blinked red as the broadcast went live. Behind the podium stood Aaliyah Carter, now 26, draped in navy silk and quiet confidence. Her locks were swept up, her voice low and steady as she adjusted the microphone. To connect is to understand, she began. But to understand, you have to listen first, not just to words, but to meaning. That's what language is, not vocabulary, not syntax, it's empathy. Applause rippled through the hall. The stage bore the seal of the United Nations. Behind her, a massive screen displayed the logo of her startup, Lingua Bridge, a small, elegant bridge stretching between two speech bubbles. One English, one Arabic. It had started with a prototype built on campus, a neural engine that didn't just translate language but tone, intent, cultural context, the emotional weight behind words. Where most tools said, I'm sorry in a dozen languages, Lingua Bridge could tell when to say it softly, when to say it formally, when not to say it at all. Within 18 months, it was being piloted in refugee camps, cross-border humanitarian negotiations, and diplomatic circles. Aaliyah had gone from university language labs to sitting with EU tech delegates in Brussels and crisis translators in war zones. She was no longer the waitress in the ballroom. Now, when people introduced her, they said things like CEO, visionary, and linguistic futurist. But she never stopped being the girl who listened first. She spoke for another 10 minutes. No slides, no notes. Walking the audience through the journey from obscurity to global innovation. From mop closets and Mandarin footnotes to neural nets and emotional calibration matrices, and when she finished, the room rose to its feet. The applause was loud, sustained, and none louder than from the man seated in the front row. Marcus Bennett had changed, too. The tailored arrogance had softened into something humbler, quieter. He still wore expensive suits, but he didn't lead with them. After the Carter Bennett Initiative launched, he slowly pivoted his portfolio, divesting from 3 major defense tech firms and redirecting capital toward literacy programs, edtech nonprofits, and cultural preservation startups. People called it an image rehab strategy. They weren't entirely wrong, but they didn't see what Aaliyah saw, the long pauses when he asked questions now. The way he leaned in when she spoke. The meetings he walked into, not to dominate, but to learn. It hadn't been a press advisor's idea to fund Lingua Bridge. It had been his. After Aaliyah stepped away from the mic, Marcus was called to the stage. He looked briefly overwhelmed by the lights, but nodded once and took his place beside her. "I won't take much of your time," he began, voice quieter than usual, "because the person you came to hear from already spoke." A small laugh rippled through the crowd. He glanced at Aaliyah. She gave him a small, encouraging smile. "Years ago," he said, "I made a bet, a cruel, thoughtless one, in a room not unlike this. I thought I was the smartest man there. I had the money, the power, the seat at the table." He paused, and then a young woman I hadn't even noticed read a contract I couldn't understand, in a language I didn't speak, and showed me a clause I didn't even know existed. In minutes, she changed everything. My perception, my values, my sense of what brilliance looks like. He turned toward her fully. "I've spent the last few years trying to deserve a second chance at being part of that story. I don't know if I ever will. But I can tell you this. She is the most brilliant woman I've ever met, and I'm grateful the world is finally listening." The room erupted into applause, not polite. Not performative, real a standing ovation. Cameras clicked. Delegates stood. The applause wasn't just for what Aaliyah had built. It was for the space she'd carved open in a world that rarely left room for people like her to speak, let alone lead. Marcus stepped back as she was pulled gently forward again, this time by a young translator in training who had won the first Carter Bennett Fellowship. He handed her a letter of thanks in Swahili, and she read it aloud, smiling. Her pronunciation, effortless. The world wasn't just listening now. It was repeating after her. When the lights dimmed and the stage cleared, Marcus and Aaliyah stood side by side for a moment in the wings. Out of sight, he turned to her. "I still can't read a word of that contract," he said. Half a joke, half a confession. She laughed. "That's fine. You don't need to." "I was wrong," he added, quieter now. "I know," she replied. "But you changed. That's what matters." He nodded, and in the warm hum of applause still echoing from the auditorium, Marcus Bennett understood something for the first time. He hadn't just invested in a company. He'd bet on a voice, and this time, he'd won. The stage in Geneva was grand but unpretentious. All clean lines, soft lighting, and rows of translation headsets glinting under the chandeliers. The Global Language Symposium had drawn diplomats, scholars, technologists, and educators from over 90 countries. Every seat was filled, and at the center of it all stood Aaliyah Carter, 30 feet above her. The massive screen projected her name in clean white font, Aaliyah Carter, founder and CEO, Lingua Bridge, keynote speaker. Reimagining language in the age of empathy, she wore a sleek, charcoal gray suit, minimal jewelry, no podium, just a headset mic and that steady presence she'd carried since the beginning. From Waitress trays to conference stages, her voice hadn't changed. Only now the world leaned in to hear it. 2 years ago, she began. "I stood on a different stage, same kind of crowd, different expectations." A faint murmur of recognition rippled through the audience. "I was introduced that day as a breakthrough founder, a translator, a symbol of some kind of brilliance that supposedly came out of nowhere." She smiled slightly, letting the weight of the words settle. But brilliance doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from overlooked corners, from libraries at closing time, from immigrant parents reading school forms by candlelight, from kids who translate for their families at age 8, from service jobs that teach you more about humanity than any boardroom ever could. In the front row, Marcus Bennett sat with his hands folded, listening. He looked older now, not worn, just softened. His legacy had shifted, realigned. These days, he was better known for what he'd helped fund than for what he'd built himself. And he was fine with that. Watching Aaliyah, he didn't feel the old sting of pride anymore. Just gratitude for the day she'd said no, for the idea she'd pitched, and for the second chance he hadn't deserved but she'd given anyway. On stage, Aaliyah gestured to the screen behind her. It flickered to life with images. Refugee children using Lingua Bridge tablets in Jordan. Deaf and hearing students collaborating on creative writing in South Korea. Diplomats using emotional translation overlays during tense negotiations. When we launched Lingua Bridge, the goal wasn't just to translate. It was to understand. Because language isn't a tool for showing off what you know. It's a bridge to what you don't. Applause broke out, soft but building. She let it pass, then continued. We've spent centuries teaching people to master language. But what if the real mastery lies in humility? In listening for what someone means, not just what they say? She paused for a beat. And what if the words you choose don't just define others, but define you? The auditorium quieted again, not out of obligation, but reverence. She looked out over the sea of faces, old, young, multilingual, skeptical, hopeful. And then she gave the line she'd become known for, though she never delivered it the same way twice. Language is power, not to humiliate, but to connect. The words you choose define not just others, but yourself. Silence, and then a wave of applause that surged through the hall like a tide. Not a polite ovation, a roar. Some stood, some wiped tears. Interpreters lowered their headsets to clap, their translations forgotten in the rush of shared feeling. Marcus was already on his feet. Aaliyah gave a single, graceful nod and stepped back, letting the moment breathe. The lights dimmed slightly as the moderator approached, and she exited stage left, heels clicking against the polished floor. The backstage was quiet. She passed tech crew members giving her silent thumbs up, assistants rushing to prep the next speaker. But she wasn't thinking about what came next. She was thinking about what came before. As she turned the corner toward the dressing area, she caught a glimpse of herself in a long mirror propped against the wall. The reflection froze her for just a moment. She looked at the woman staring back. No tray, no apron, no flicker of fear hiding beneath her eyes. This wasn't the girl who'd been dared into a moment. This was the woman who had taken that moment and built a future from it. She smiled at her reflection, small but sure. Then she turned and walked on, out of the wings, out of the past, and into a world still learning how to listen.